Okay, students, for this Doing History inquiry, we're going to be talking about freedom of speech. Question focus document. This is this cartoon from Winsor McCay from 1917 called Must Liberty's Light Go Out? Who's this here? And what is she typically holding? A torch? And that torch says enlightenment. What just happened to enlightenment? What does this statue typically represent in Americans' vision? What just happened to the statue? Tell me, based on this image, what appears to be the problem? What was just taken from the Statue of Liberty? After you've identified the problem facing America in the past, generate a question about the document. For our purposes in this assignment, we really need to talk about what the First Amendment is in order to better understand freedom of speech. So in 1788, the Constitution is ratified, but a number of states asked the federal government to add some amendments to protect certain rights. James Madison introduces 12 amendments in 1789. And those amendments go out to the states for ratification. They were adopted in 1791. We know those 10 amendments as the Bill of Rights. First question, based on your prior knowledge, in your own words, what does the First Amendment actually say? What right do people believe it guarantees? So without reading the First Amendment, you've all heard of the First Amendment before. Some of you may have claimed that your First Amendment rights were taken at times. Just tell me what you know. What does the First Amendment say? After you've done that, we're going to read the First Amendment to try and actually understand what it does say. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Does this sound familiar? So we need to find out, what does the First Amendment actually say? I want you to think about who can't tell you that you cannot do those things. How does the First Amendment start off? Congress shall make no law, and then it lists all of these things. They can't make a law that establishes a religion. They can't make a law that prohibits free exercise of religion. They can't make a law abridging freedom of speech. They can't make a law taking away the rights of the press. They can't make a law taking away your right to assemble. They can't make a law that prevents you from petitioning the government. So really, who is the First Amendment restricting? Congress? How is that different? How is the amendment saying that Congress can't tell you you can't do these things different than the government telling you that you always have the right to do those things? There might be a slight difference in application that we'll learn about in this assignment. All right. For our contemporary policy debate, we're going to learn about something very recent. I'm sure you all have paid attention to this because it has to do with social media. Following the insurrection at the Capitol, social media companies started doing what? Banning Trump. I'm sure you've all heard of this. So we need to find out, what's the policy problem related to freedom of speech? What had President Trump used social media for? You probably know this based on the article. What did the social media companies do to Trump's account? Let's listen to the article.
Big tech is also getting involved in the reckoning over the assault on Congress. It's not only Twitter that deplatformed the president, cutting him off from some 88 million followers. Facebook, Snapchat, Reddit, and even Pinterest suspended Donald Trump's presence indefinitely. And on Saturday, Amazon booted Parler, a popular social media platform for the far right, off its web hosting service, and Apple removed it off its app store. They all say President Trump's online rhetoric incited the kind of violence we saw on January 6th. Jennifer Greigill is an assistant professor specializing in social media at Syracuse University. We've reached them in New York. Welcome to the program.
Hi, nice to be with you.
This is a deeply divisive move we're seeing. Your reaction to what's happening?
Well, it really highlights the complexity of the media ecosystem. There's lots of interconnected parts in the technology world and the social media world that helps an app come to market. So I think everyone's starting to piece this together. The companies are starting to understand that Parler and other apps have not done enough to make sure that they are essentially not dangerous products, and they're seeking to make sure that they are not contributing to harm that has taken place here to the American democracy, but also the public safety at this point after what we saw on the Capitol.
Why didn't they react sooner, do you think? I mean, are they just positioning themselves to deal with a new administration, or is this something else?
I think that this is a reckoning that's come when it comes to social media. First, it was like, what are these things? And there isn't a lot of regulation in this space. So we have a couple of laws that allow essentially platforms to moderate their content, but also nothing really properly motivating them to make sure that they do it fast enough or that they run these companies in ways that are safe.
I want to talk about Parler in particular briefly because I think people might be surprised to learn that Amazon has the power to shut down a site it doesn't own. Can you explain briefly?
Well, they're not shutting it down per se. They are making sure that they don't support and essentially provide the infrastructure to a company that is dangerous at this point. Parler is still able to set up their company and to run it. They just need to do it more independently. And these companies have decided they don't want to support this and be a part of it. And that's their right.
Okay, we've already heard a couple things. Back to a worksheet. What is the policy problem related to freedom of speech? What had President Trump used social media for? What did we find out? Social media has been used by President Trump for a number of things. And what was the thing that happened most recently? He used social media and he used his platform in order to instruct people to go to the Capitol. And what did those people end up doing? What was the action those social media companies took after Trump's use of social media in this way? They banned his accounts. Why is it people support this? Ultimately, what happened at the Capitol? Was there a riot? Insurrection, as some people call it? Was that dangerous? People died. It became a public safety issue. So if some people think we should restrict people's use of social media if it's related to public safety, why do people oppose that?
I mean, you bring up, I think, the essential point about all this, which is that there is a great debate about what exactly social media is. President Trump and his supporters say that these bans and suspensions amount to a violation of their freedom of speech. We know that free speech has its limits when it comes to fomenting violence, and we also know that private companies aren't covered by the First Amendment. But do you foresee legal challenges to these decisions that might have some traction?
Okay. Is this why people oppose him being banned from social media? They think it's a violation of their freedom of speech. Okay, but now that you all have reread the First Amendment, does a private company telling somebody that they can't use their platform actually violate the First Amendment? Remember that the First Amendment prevented the government from creating a law saying that you don't have freedom of speech. It doesn't say anything about private companies not being able to restrict speech. If we were to think back about some other major news events, Colin Kaepernick, the quarterback, and other NFL players who had been kneeling. This became an issue that people related to the First Amendment, but it was entirely within those private companies, those football teams' rights to be able to tell their employees, the players, that they can't do certain things that some people considered protected by the First Amendment. So here we have people who believe you shouldn't be able to use social media if it's creating public danger. Other people who believe we shouldn't restrict people's use of social media because that takes away their First Amendment right, what they believe to be their First Amendment right. So what do you think? Should the social media companies have banned former President Donald Trump's accounts? Is it wrong for these companies to be able to, in some ways, silence the president? Or do you believe that the use of social media is not a right? After you've answered the question, we'll move on. Yeah, it's time for our next formative task. Now we're going to relate a past case study. We're going to talk about something called House Resolution 8753. What should be the goal of First Amendment? Are there limitations on our rights? House Resolution 8753 said, whoever, when the United States is at war, shall willfully utter, print, write, or publish any disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about the form of government of the United States, or the Constitution of the United States, or the military of the United States, or the flag, or any language intended to bring the form of government, the Constitution, the military, or the flag of the United States into contempt, scorn, contumely, or disrepute, shall willfully by word or act oppose the cause of the United States therein, shall be punished by a fine of not more than $10,000 or imprisonment for not more than 20 years or both. What are they talking about? Willfully utter. What does it mean to utter? If you utter something under your breath, you say it under your breath. So if anybody says, prints, or writes, what? Anything disloyal, profane, inappropriate, or abusive about the United States, what's going to happen? They're going to go to jail. Does that seem like a restriction of the First Amendment? The amendment here to the Espionage Act is going to make it illegal to criticize in speech or print the United States government. This is all related to the idea of sedition. Sedition is the crime of saying, writing, or doing something that encourages people to disobey their government. So if the United States is fighting in a war, if somebody criticizes the government, they've committed a crime. That's what we need to understand that we're debating. Should people, at times of war, be able to criticize the government? For our historic context, we need to understand again that the First Amendment prevents the government from restricting speech, but then right after the First Amendment is written, 8 years, in 1798, John Adams signs the Sedition Act into law, making it illegal to criticize the government when we were on the verge of war with France. The idea was that if people were criticizing the government during the war, would that make it harder for the government to win the war? And why would you not want to make it harder for the government to win the war? 2 months after the signing of the Sedition Act, newspaper editor Benjamin Franklin Bach, grandson of Benjamin Franklin, is arrested under the Sedition Act for calling John Adams blind, bald, crippled, and toothless. That's quite the insult of the president. A total of 17 people were charged of violating the Sedition Act, and 10 of them were convicted. After Adams loses the election of 1800, President Thomas Jefferson takes over, and he pardons all persons convicted under the act. So we need to know, in our historic context, the United States creates the, quote, freedom of speech, making it against the law for Congress to create a law restricting speech, but then only 8 years later, the government restricted speech. Jump forward to 1917. What was going on in 1917? We've just been studying about World War I. So we need to know that America's fighting in the war, and they passed laws in order to restrict speech. So does that help us understand the context? What was going on? We're going to specifically talk about something that was written by a guy named Charles Schneck. We're trying to find out why a government would be worried about a pamphlet like Assert Your Rights. The pamphlet said the Socialist Party says that any officers of the law entrusted with the administration of conscription violate the United States Constitution when they refuse to recognize your right to express your opposition to the draft. Remember that World War I created a draft, so if anybody is going to express opposition to that, he doesn't want people to get drafted. To draw this country into the horrors of the war in Europe, to force the youth of our land into the bloody trenches of war-crazy nations would be a crime so big it defies description. No pleas about a war for democracy can cloud the issue. Does he seem to be a fan of the war? Described it the horrors of the war. Bloody trenches, war-crazy nations. Democracy cannot be shot into a nation. It must come spontaneously and purely from within. To advocate the persecution of other peoples through the fighting of a war is an insult to every good and wholesome American tradition. You are responsible. You must do your share to maintain, support, and uphold the rights of the people of this country. In this world crisis, where do you stand? Are you with the forces of liberty and light, or war and darkness? Why would the federal government be worried about a pamphlet like this? This pamphlet criticizes the government to go to war, and it criticizes the government to create a draft. Why would the government not want people criticizing them and their decisions during a war, especially criticizing a draft? What happens if he convinces enough people to not sign up for the draft? Well, the United States is going to have to arrest a bunch of people for draft dodging. Will that make it harder to focus on winning the war? Charles Schneck is arrested for this pamphlet. Do we understand why the government would be worried about the pamphlet? Okay, section 1 guiding question. Why do some people think speech is a freedom that can be restricted? We're going to read the speech by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes. He is a Chief Court Justice who explains the ruling in Schneck v. United States. So Charles Schneck, who had been arrested for that pamphlet, says that his rights were violated, and that case goes all the way to the Supreme Court. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes is going to explain why he thinks speech can be restricted. Justice Holmes said, "The character of every act depends upon the circumstances in which it is done. The most stringent protection of free speech would not protect a man in falsely shouting fire in a theater and causing a panic. It's interesting language. The character of every act depends upon the circumstances in which it is done. What's he mean by circumstances? What was going on at the time? What was happening? Are those someone's circumstances? So the way you act, how the way you act, it depends on what's going on. His example, free speech would not protect a man in falsely shouting fire in a theater and causing a panic. Why would we not want somebody yelling fire in a theater? What could happen if people start to panic? Will they run for the exits? What will happen if people are running for the exits? The question in every case is whether the words used are used in such circumstances and are of such a nature as to create a clear and present danger that they will bring about the substantive evils that Congress has a right to prevent. Whether the words used are used to create a clear and present danger. What's he mean by clear and present danger? If something is clear to understand, it's easy to understand, right? And present means that it's happening right then and there. Do we want people to be able to use their words if they're going to create something that is dangerous? If somebody's creating something that's dangerous, should Congress have the right to prevent it? He finishes by saying, when a nation is at war, many things that might be said in time of peace are such a hindrance to its effort that their utterance is not acceptable as long as men fight, and no court could disregard them as protected by any constitutional right. So what has Justice Holmes said in this? What's most important? Does he think that your freedom of speech is unlimited? Evidently, it's not. Why does he say there are limitations on speech? What can speech cause? And why does that matter for today's debate over freedom of speech? Why does the idea of Holmes that you can't use speech if it creates danger, how is that related to President Trump's bans from social media? Section 2 should be pretty easy to understand. Why do people believe our government does not have the right to restrict our rights? This cartoon from Art Young, for the safety of the public. This man here, the puppy with his muzzle, this is a newspaper editor. Somebody who works for the press. What muzzle has been put on him? What have we done by restricting his ability to talk? The espionage law has put a muzzle on people. Is that something that we should be okay with? It's a pretty simple argument. If we believe that the First Amendment tells us that the government can't take away our freedom of speech, what has this law done? And should the government have been able to do that? Why does that matter for today's debate over freedom of speech? What do some people think about the right to speak? That you should have freedom of it? If President Trump is not allowed to use Twitter, have they taken away his, quote, freedom of speech? All right, step 4, choices and consequences. What did the policymakers decide to do? Why did they make that choice? What are the consequences of that policy decision? The Supreme Court voted unanimously 9-0, and ruled the Espionage Act was constitutional. They said that the government has the right to restrict your speech if your speech is dangerous. So since that time, over and over and over again, freedom of speech has been brought up by the Supreme Court. At times, sometimes they say that you do not have the freedom of speech if it can relate to violence, if it obstructs recruiting, because we need to win a war. In 1942, the First Amendment did not protect fighting words, which, by being said, cause injury or cause an immediate breach of the peace. You can't say things that will cause people to get injured or cause people to break the law. Interestingly enough, though, in 1943, West Virginia board policy requiring students and teachers to recite the Pledge of Allegiance was unconstitutional. So we cannot force citizens to confess by word or act their faith in matters of opinion. So sometimes we do prevent the government from restricting our speech, like what happened here. And while the World War I resulted in cases where we could restrict people's speech and could not restrict people's speech, and during the Vietnam War, First Amendment does not protect burning draft cards as a form of symbolic peace. Fun for you all as students, 1969, the Tinker vs. Des Moines case, students were able to wear black armbands to protest the Vietnam War, and that was protected by the First Amendment. Did it cause an immediate danger? Is that why they were allowed to say it? So over and over again, you can see that the United States debates whether or not the First Amendment does or does not protect somebody's right to say something. 1989, Texas versus Johnson, flag burning as political protest is a form of symbolic speech protected by the First Amendment. Again, and again. So it's important to know that policymakers have chosen to restrict speech if they deem what about the speech? If it can cause harm? So what are the consequences of that policy decision? What does Congress know? What can the government do? And what should we all know as people? If you ever go to an airport, you should know that you can't yell bomb, because just like yelling fire in a theater, you could cause a panic and someone could get harmed. We all need to accept that our freedom of speech has restrictions. There's a Supreme Court justice who once explained this, saying that one man's right to swing his arm stops where another man's nose starts. You can walk around down the hallway and swing your arms as wildly as you want, but the minute that your fist connects with someone else's nose, you've lost your right to swing your arms. All right, let's make a comparison and contrast between the two policy debates. What's the similarity? We're talking about speech. In the past, who was it that restricted speech? The government? Because of the war? There's a big difference here. Who restricted speech today? Was it the government or was it social media? So if in the past the government said, you can't say things during times of war or you'll get arrested, social media companies said, you can't say things if they cause danger or you'll lose your account. Is there a big difference between getting arrested and going to jail versus losing your Twitter account? I think it's easy to argue that. All right, if you want to create your policy advice form, you can have extra credit for this assignment. If you have any questions, please let me know.